Greetings, students, and welcome back to the stream, and welcome to the After School Podcast, edition number... I lost count. Welcome, everybody. I hope your Saturdays are going well. I hope you have been learning, working hard, playing hard, and all of the above. Hello, Professor Sir! Ooh, what should my official salute be? Everyone has, like, their own salute, right? Like, there's this, there's the, cross the heart, there's the new Helldivers one. There's Attack on Titan where you do across the back. I need my own salute. That's what I think. It should be like... No, I don't like that. To the head and slap the eye. No, it's stupid. It should be super kawaii for no reason. Professor! No, that's bad. That's bad. Don't let me do that again. Please. That was a bad choice. Super kawaii. Yeah, I gotta be cute. Oh, it's Sunday for you? Oh, God, you people are so far ahead of me, it's crazy. Oh, man. Oh, yeah, the throw won't work on the podcast yet, because I can only have it set to one portion of the screen at a time. I can't change that depending on which screen I'm on. So it's just not on during the podcast. Hey, Yellow Soviet, how's it going? It's been a while. The question to where is the fedora? It's right here. It's always behind me, ready to be grabbed. But the thing is, I have the long hair right now, and this messes it up. Plus, as you can see, this is really beat up. It's really dirty and kind of grody. I live with two other cats. So... I just figured for aesthetic purposes, I will be going with the, just the hair for a good little while. Australian. Ah! The superior species. Oh yeah, you guys have been building the Duke Fishron arena in Terraria, haven't you? Yeah, you keep posting this stuff, and I just keep thinking, my God. Oh yeah, the dab! That is the official salute of the channel. What was I thinking? I'm freaking crazy. I hate my country. It's way too hot. I love that. Oh, that's funny. Everybody hates their country for something, right? And Australia is got a lot of them. Your animals are too big. Your country's too hot. Everyone makes fun of your Vegemite sandwiches. But I live in the US. I have, like, the most reasons, for people to make fun of my country, so... Okay, so, let's talk about today's topic. Game piracy. So, as you might have seen from the title, and from the thumbnail, and from whatever else I've been saying, pirating games is definitely not a black and white topic. It is a very gray topic with a lot of white in it. Ooh, I gotta hydrate. Yes! Drink. At least they aren't British. That's so insulting. Salute to the British in the chat and across the world. We feel your pain. Definitely a strange topic for sure. Not counting emulators, I've never done it myself. Indeed. So there's a caveat that I want to give out right at the beginning, just in case anyone gets the wrong idea. I do not advocate stealing. Stealing is wrong in most circumstances. But game piracy is a way bigger topic than just that. So, like, stealing games online, taking them from the Walmart, that's not a good thing. You know, stealing is stealing. And that's why I preface everything by saying, yes, it is illegal. But there's a big old asterisk next to this that we need to talk about. So, when it comes to game piracy, it really depends on the context of what you're taking. And I think we can split that into kind of three categories. The first being new games, right? New games, modern games, games that have been out for maybe 5, maybe 10 years. If you're stealing those games, You're stealing. You're straight up taking something that you shouldn't be stealing. The second category, old games that are no longer circulating. You can't find them on, in places like retro games, arcade games, ancient games, games that are no longer available in any context besides the sites that prop these up. The ROMs, the emulators, these very old games. And in the third category, games that are no longer circulating but are still available, like on old stores, Xbox 360, PS3, PS4, stuff like that. Previous generations that aren't modern per se, but are still available. So let's talk about those. Let's get a few opening statements here. Here's my opening statement. If you pirate from indie devs, you are a bad person. Indeed, that is a very good context to put in. If you are taking from an indie developer, you are a bad person. Because that indie dev is depending on every sale of their game. They don't have the resources that a AAA studio has. They are depending on these games for their livelihood. And every game that is pirated from those developers is taking out of their pockets. It's taking out of their future potential. And it's just plain thievery just because you didn't want to pay for their game. And most of the time, indie games are cheaper than normal games, right? So, and that is to say, stealing AAA games doesn't necessarily make it better. Because, let's say Star Wars Battlefront 2. I'm not ever going to pay for that game because I don't want to give EA another dime of my money. But if I stole that game, I'd still be in the wrong. Because yes, it's a studio that doesn't need money. I'm not really hurting any individual, but it is still an act of thievery for my sake, right? It's not really a thumbs up for it. But that whole circumstance changes as soon as we go to old games. And that's why we have that second category, the key category. You're pirating Fortnite. Yeah, you're pirating a free-to-play game. All free-to-play games are pirated games. He's on point here. You have a point about 10 minutes? Okay, perfect. Some games, Pokemon Picross, is literally impossible to obtain without buying a whole console with it installed. Yes, and that paradigm brings up the perfect point. Game preservation is such an important thing in this industry. It's literally a problem that only the game industry seems to have, because old movies have all been preserved, and there's no issue with them being suddenly lost, unless they were like in the old film days, like you lose the original film. That's why like a whole bunch of Doctor Who episodes and old BBC stuff, literally they used to throw out all their old film reels once they were like 10 or 20 years old. But they stopped doing that, and thanks to the digital age, all this stuff gets majorly preserved. Everything gets preserved. TV shows, movies, like all that stuff. The digital age allows us for preservation of that type of media forever. You will probably never lose another content of media from movies or TV shows ever again, just because of the era we live on. But video games are such a different topic, because video games are not something that exists in the same context as TV shows and movies. Those are basically like 2-hour segments of video files. Break every video ever made, every movie, every TV show, it's just a set of video files, right? And yes, they are owned by certain people, but they are storable. They are very storable. But video games are very specific constructs. They're like giant, complex, interwoven clockwork media files, right? It has to be built the same way. It has to have the same assets included. It has to have the same programming, the same language. Anyone who plays games knows. In the modern day, anyone who plays games in the modern day knows, porting old games, remaking old games is so hard and almost always causes problems. So, How do you preserve those old antique games, so to speak? Let's take the original Super Mario Brothers. This is one of the most important video games of all time. Maybe the most important video game of all time. But what if one day Nintendo decided, we're just not going to host this in our databases anymore? That would be insane, but let's say they did. Let's say that it's just no longer in their monetary interest to hold it. And they deleted it, they got rid of it, to make room for other stuff. Now, what happens to that original source? What happens to that original game? Recreating it is not possible, because this is such an ancient game made by specific people with specific assets on a specific console. Remaking it would be practically impossible. And the only way to protect it is to use all of those ports that have been made for other stuff to protect it. So Super Mario Bros. Would be safe. But what about the games that don't have those ports? Take the original Atari games, the original Commodore 64 stuff, the stuff that only existed in the smallest of contexts. Some of those video games were removed, the originals were lost, and they will never see the light of day again. Because how can you remake video games like that? How can you remake the old stuff before it was ported to digital stuff? But right, we'll get to that. Pokey brings up a good point, but I'll get to that. And that's why ROMs are so important. Before the era of ROMs, video games that were lost forever. But then came the era of emulators and being able to port this old stuff onto your computers and be able to play it on your stuff. And suddenly, these games were preserved in another format that was so much safer, and were basically just a couple of media files, right? Just like the movies, just like the TV shows. And now suddenly, I have this ROM file that has an entire video game preserved in it. And now that game will probably be preserved forever. But they're still kind of stealing it, aren't they? Because they don't own Pokemon Emerald. They don't own Donkey Kong Country. They don't own Super Mario Brothers. So what happens when game companies abandon their old video games? Are we just supposed to let that happen? Personally, no. I don't think that's acceptable in any circumstance. That's like taking out the original movies, you know? One of the oldest and most famous movies ever made, I don't know if you've seen this one, is where a rocket takes off and buries itself in the eye of the moon. Very old movie, so old. We're talking like the dawn of cinema. And that film was almost lost forever. It's not the first movie ever made, but it's one of the first movies ever made. And if that were to be lost, cinema history would be gone forever. And video games are the same way. The first video games ever made, the first consoles ever made, all of this is history that needs to be preserved. But video game companies have no incentive to protect video games because they're not going to sell these old video games. They're only for their old consoles, and no one's buying the old consoles anymore. So why keep the old stuff? And this is a fundamental... it's a fundamental discourse and gap between the community and the companies. But let's take a moment and go through everyone's comments. Doom is one of the most infamous because it's been ported like 40 trillion times. That's true. You can play Doom on a the old Tamagotchi. Yeah, that's what it was. It was a Tamagotchi that they ported a Doom to, which was like, what the hell? Unofficial ones are entire engineering mix, right? I'm pretty sure everyone besides Nintendo lawyers agree that downloading games that cannot be obtained at all nowadays is pretty much completely legal. Right, and that's where that gap exists. Because technically, if I stole this old game and used a ROM and emulator of it, legally speaking, I'm breaking the law because I didn't pay for that game. Somebody took that game, turned it into a digital format, broadcasted it, and published it for other people to use. I downloaded it, and now I'm playing it on my stream. That is illegal in every step of the way. But nobody cares because the video game companies have officially abandoned that game. They're not making any money from it anyways. To them, it doesn't matter enough. But if they ever pursued it legally, they would win because their case is ironclad. And of course, some companies are worse than others, Nintendo being, God, such an example. And that's really the sad part about this. There is no presence in the gaming community for old games to be published to the public. Because old movies and old TV shows are broadcast in all sorts of different ways. Streaming services are perfect for archiving old movies and TV shows. These publishing companies can take these movies that are decades old, sell them to these streaming services, and suddenly have old movies publishing and making money for them. It's perfect. But gaming doesn't have an equivalent to this. Gaming doesn't have a service, so to speak, to broadcast these old games. Unless you're on certain platforms. And it's kind of baffling that they don't, right? Because ROMs and emulators have proved to a point that, yeah, people want to play these old games. Why doesn't the industry have an equivalent to a streaming service yet? The reason why is because streaming video games is so much more complicated and so much harder, and it would require a concerted effort from every video game company to create a large enough service. Someone has to step in and be that service. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's like Netflix hit gold when they created their streaming service because it was a service that was already being proven with the DVD rental service. Blockbuster had already proven that was working. But then Netflix was able to provide, well, we can give this to you digitally and easily, and then the rest is history. But a similar service for video games is difficult because emulation is hard. Yes, Pokey is saying it perfectly. Emulation is so hard. You don't think about it because your computer's so good, but emulation is so complicated because all these different languages, all these different consoles, everything is so precise. Every emulator requires its own bag of tricks to work with, right? And even the emulators and ROMs that we have online are not perfect. Like, my Pokemon Emerald copy keeps crashing. Or it used to keep crashing because it just wasn't compatible with my old computer. Like, how do you foresee stuff like that? And the time and effort required for something like that, it's not enticing enough to game companies. I truly hope someone comes to the rescue on that regard, right? Because people want to play these old games, and not only that, they want to preserve them. Because imagine a world where the first video games ever made were just lost forever. Like Pong. It's a joke to talk about Pong like this, but Pong is important. Pong is one of the first most important video games that went mainstream. Scroll for your car statement? Yeah, sure. If someone were to download my car in such a way that they get a completely different car, such that it even has its own license plate, registration papers, by my point of view, that's not my car, that's their car. That's true. That's a great example. If the download has changed the game so much to the point that it's not the same game anymore, or it functions completely differently, can you really call it the same game? I don't know. I guess that the argument there would be, is it transformed enough, even if it's accidental? But yeah, that's what Microsoft is trying to do for over 2 decades. Yes, I will. That's another one I do want to bring up. Xbox has been doing a very nice service lately with the Xbox Game Pass, with Xbox Gold. They have been allowing people to play their old video games on their newest consoles, which is like, that's brilliant. Backwards compatibility. Why is backwards compatibility something that people want so badly? Because they want to play the old video games. They have bought all these old video games. Oh, and that's another thing. Old video games don't work on newer content, right? Like, you have this old Xbox 360 collection. It's not going to work on the latest Xbox unless they build in a backwards compatibility. Old movies and old TV shows don't have this problem. You can play DVDs and CDs on any player nowadays, which is just, it's built in backwards compatibility. But video games, every generation, every year, every new console creates a gap in a wall between the previous generation. So all these video games get locked behind this era that becomes harder and harder to access. Steam could easily make hundreds of millions if they tried to do a sort of passive library. I agree. Steam is another one that Steam and Xbox are probably the closest to a streaming service in gaming. The difference being that obviously you have to make it compatible with Steam first, and it's more of a game store than it is a game streaming service, though I guess you can't really create that type of experience. But man, yeah, Steam would probably be the best equipped to do this. So why don't they? They have to wait for companies to come to them to sell their content on their platform, and they are the ones who have to put the effort in to port it to Steam. Why isn't Steam creating that incentive? Go to companies and say, we want to broadcast your old games on our platform. They would make millions. It's crazy. Yeah, I'm getting a couple messages here. What happened to the Ocean Arena? Did you guys lose everything? What's going on over there? So Joam says, I think DVDs are a bad example. It's more like trying to use old CPU in a modern device. Oh, I was using it as a context of every movie that managed to make it to the CD-ROM era, DVD-ROM era, everything from that forward has been backwards compatible, right? Like, we can still play DVDs that came out in the first years of DVDs. That's how backwards compatible it is, right? Hey, Mike, how's it going? We're talking about game piracy here, and we're talking about how the different mediums created different gaps between it. And granted, there will always be issues for movies and TV shows. Like, obviously, old film, unless you ported that to digital, you wouldn't be able to watch it any other way. But yeah. The Ocean Arena got drained somehow. Of course. I mean, if you have a giant floating water bowl, it's going to spring a leak at some point. Right. Let's get back on topic. So, just saying that right off the bat, old games, ROMs, emulators, I think that's totally acceptable. It's a whole market for things, and I think it's good. But now we got to move to the more modern era, and we got to think about, modern games, stuff that's more available, stuff like that. This is where it becomes obvious. Yeah, stealing these is not right. If I were to steal the latest Persona game or the Helldivers 2, and I didn't pay a dime for those, I used those stupid game code sites that straight up are stealing thousands of games from people every day. That's stealing. That type of piracy is not acceptable. These are people who are thieves, who are trying to make a buck by stealing things and selling them in the black market, right? It's the black market for video games. And that will never be acceptable, right? And I think everyone can agree with that. Even if it's a company you don't like, or if it's you want to stick it to Nintendo or stuff like that, stealing from them isn't the answer, right? And people are hurt so much by this because indie devs who have their games stolen thousands of times are losing so much potential money for that. So it's a shame that these sites exist in such prominent form. Speaking, of course, I cannot say I have pirate modern games. I can say I know a fair bit about piracy. Agreed. I've never pirated anything modern. I use ROMs and emulators all the time. Like, that's how I was able to play through the entire Final Fantasy series, because I wasn't able to have access to the older ones. So I use ROMs and emulators. But I would never steal the latest Final Fantasy 16, right? I should buy that. That's an honest, available product that I should be able to, I will and should buy. Mike says, watching movies on YouTube with 140p and an audio quality from a quality lower than 2010 tablets. Having some trouble, huh? Yeah, the older movies ported to YouTube. And that's a form of piracy too, right? Like, there is a line that I think everyone can see between the difference between availability and game preservation and just plain old stealing, right? Because technically you're stealing across the whole spectrum, but there's a line where it becomes, all right, there's no excuse. You're just stealing this now, right? There's no excuse that's good enough for that. Like, you could, you're stealing food, if you're starving, that's acceptable. But if you're just stealing, you're just stealing, right? This is why GTA 6 won't be on PC. What do you mean? Of course it's going to be on PC. Why wouldn't it be on PC? That's the biggest market. Unless I'm missing something. And then we get to another kind of adjacent topic to that, which is why I created this third category over here. The older games, but not the ancient games. Brand deals. Good point. Good point. So let's talk about, like, Xbox 360 or GameCube games or 3DS. We have all these older games that have markets that are open for them, but now they're closing. Like, some of them infamously are Nintendo and PlayStation and I think Xbox are closing down these older stores because they no longer want to support this marketplace, these amount of games, because it's no longer financially beneficial for them to do so. But if they do that, if they close these old marketplaces, then all of these games are lost. But they are far enough along in the development cycle that making emulation of these games a significant challenge. Is it acceptable then to pirate these games that are about to be lost? Or maybe even after they're lost. So there was an example, I think it was The Completionist or someone. They bought every single video game on the 3DS store. If I'm wrong, correct me on this. And because they were shutting down the store. And the fact that someone would have to do that to preserve all of those games is ridiculous. Why does it fall on the consumer to preserve these old games? Hey, little itty bitty, how's it going? Jumping right into the topic here of when is game piracy acceptable and when is it not. It's not PC initial launch because Sony and Microsoft are paying Rockstar to not release it. Money! Money. It always comes down to money, right? The Completionist did do that? Okay, yeah. So that was a thing. But the Completionist has that money, right? What about other people? I can't afford every game on the 3DS store. So what about me? Now my only option to get those old games that I never bought on the 3DS store is to either buy them off of Amazon or eBay or whatever the hell else, or pirate them. Technically speaking, because it's modern enough, because I do have an Xbox 360 and I do have a 3DS, I feel like I should buy them on Amazon first before pirating them. But eventually it reaches a point, the games become old enough and outdated enough that trying to get them on, say, the Amazon Marketplace or eBay or whatever is no longer viable. It's not without paying through the nose. Like, old games on these marketplaces are marked up so high, like $200 for one game, $300 for rare games, you know, crap like that. It's like, no way, man. I'm not gonna buy this old version of a game from somebody else. Just because I want to play it doesn't mean... Just because I want to play an older game doesn't mean I should have to pay more for it. And then we get into the argument, well, when is it okay? And this is where the line continuously goes up. It's like the discussion of what's retro and what's not. Where eventually does it become acceptable to preserve old games? At what line does the emulation become an acceptable preservation method? Gaming's an expensive hobby. A lot of people can't afford it, so they pirate games. That's very true. So true. A lot of Scott Cawthon FNAF creators' pre-FNAF games are lost media, which has forced people to try and save all of his like 50 games before FNAF 1, because at the current moment there's a grand total of 1 Desolate Hope that's still officially for sale, although it's free. Man, think about that. That's such a modern example too. Scott Cawthon, yeah, FNAF creator, is now one of the most important video game creators out there. He changed the industry with FNAF, right? But he made like you said, like dozens, maybe 50 games. I don't know how much exactly. He made so many games before FNAF 1. So that's kind of important history to see the development of this person. But if they're all gone now, and no one had any incentive to purchase those before that chance came up, what happens now? That history is lost. Those old games, be they high quality or not, that's not the issue here. Shouldn't there be an automatic way to store games just across the board? They don't have to be available to the public, but just to store them, to protect them, there's just not a... I don't know. There's just not a good way for that right now without the creator putting in that type of support beforehand. Okay, I'm bringing up the topic I had earlier. A lot of people pirate games as like a trial run, and they enjoy the game, they don't go check it out and pay for it. What are your thoughts on this? Ooh, that's a very interesting scenario. Yeah, I can get that. Some people will use emulation and piracy to try out a game. It doesn't even have to be an old game. It can be a new game. Like if someone gave you a free copy of the latest game and they had bought it, isn't that kind of the same thing? If you intend to buy your own copy of it, what harm is it as it's a pirated game? But then again, that really comes down to the intent of the user. And I think a lot of people, whether they admit it or not, if they could get a game for free versus whether they would pay for it, they would get it for free, right? Like if the opportunity was presented to them. Because, you know, we like free stuff, and like that's why we like demos so much. That's why we like trials so much and beta versions. We want to play this game as much as we can without having to pay for it. But we want to see if it's worth our money. We want to test it. Is piracy an acceptable version of that? Honestly, my personal opinion, I don't think it is. Because if you pirate a game in an attempt to try it out, then you have just as much incentive to not pay for it as you would to pay for it. Because you already have the game pirated, right? If you wanted to, it would be just simple to just keep playing that pirated version. It may be another way for people to try out the game, but it has too much incentive for them to continue not paying for it, which just doesn't help anyone. So, and Pokey says, I will say I personally pirated Elden Ring and loved the game so much I decided to just go and buy it. And you know, that's fair. These things do happen. You know, I will agree that it can be a method for people to do that. I just don't think as a practice in general it should be allowed, just because, again, intent of the user. If a person pirates it with the sole intention of trying it out, no harm is done because they'll eventually buy it. But it's just as easy for another person who has no intention of paying for it to just pirate it and play the whole thing, right? And then the developer loses out. What brought on this discussion? Oh, we were just bringing up different scenarios on when piracy is acceptable. And Pokey brought up the idea of, what if you used it as a demo to then pay for the full game? Is that an acceptable use? And I personally don't think it is. Because, again, if the user does that, and, you know, like Pokey's a great example, if they do it, no harm in the really is done. They've bought the game, developer earned money, no harm done. But there'll be so many other people who take advantage of that piracy option to not pay for it and still play the whole game. Hence why it's not really something that should be an option. And that's why demos and trials are so important. Give the people incentive to not steal the game. Not that they should have to do that, but, you know, we live in reality. I hang out in a lot of piracy circles, and yes, people can just not buy it, but the community of people that go out and just refuse to ever buy a video game is actually pretty small. The trial people, game professors, are the majority. Well, that's good to hear. That is good to hear. I like that. You know, because you would assume the opposite, that most people in that community would just go full broke for it. I personally would argue pirating games is okay if the game is already disingenuous. If the game is already disingenuous. Oh, okay. So this is another interesting caveat. What if you're pissed at the game? What if the company is screwing you over? Take Battlefront 2 or Nintendo with their endless crap. Does the company, being a greedy SOB company, make it acceptable to pirate their games? It's such a FU kind of thing, right? And legally speaking, obviously not. Morally speaking, kind of, right? Because if EA is trying to manipulate as many people as they can to give up their money, why should them? That's why I've boycotted EA games. I will never give EA another cent of my money because I hate that company. But would I actively steal their games? I don't think I could do that. You know, because at that point they're the bad guys, but once I start stealing their games, then I'm the bad guy as well. I think piracy is wrong for the most part, but there are some exceptions. I'll agree with that, Alphonse. I'd say there's more, just because the ROM emulator community is so large, I think there's more reason for good piracy, just because there's more games on that catalog than not. But yeah, I would agree. They're stealing games and as a general rule shouldn't be allowed. Because you're stealing the game. Let's be honest here. We call it game piracy, but you're stealing the game. You're not paying money for it. You're taking it out of someone's pocket. It's thievery. The reasons for that are very important, and there are degrees to this, right? But we can't forget that even if we want to stick it to EA, we want to stick it to Nintendo, we want to stick it to whoever is pissed us off, we shouldn't let ourselves be brought down to their level, so to speak. As much as I hate EA and as much as Nintendo makes me mad, I don't think I could ever bring myself to actively steal from them, because then that doesn't really hurt them. It doesn't really help my karma, you know. It just, yeah, I've got a free video game and they've lost money, but they've already gotten millions of dollars. I've not really helped them. Boycotting accomplishes the same thing, in my opinion, and I'm not stealing anything. So, but at the same time, I don't judge other people for pirating those games, because I also have that feeling in my gut. Yeah, stick it to them. You know, that's the grayness that we're talking about here. Whenever I hear people sticking it to these companies, I'm like, hell yeah, let's go. But I would never personally do it, you know? Let's see. Let's go through the comments. I think a great example is any Nintendo games, as you can't play them on PC. My God, that's true, isn't it? Why is Nintendo so PC impervious? I don't get that. That's such a revenue of money for them. They're like the Apple of the video game world. They're so paranoid about people messing with their product. It's crazy. One of the most expensive retro games to buy physically is Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Oh, I think I've heard of this one, yeah. The game specifically is $700 to buy. Oh, God! And that's what I was mentioning earlier, right? Is it worth it to buy old games that are that marked up if you have a much better option of emulation? Hot damn. I feel I have a much stronger feelings about pirating media rather than just games. Yeah, and then that crosses over into other stuff, like I'll admit I've pirated so many movies in my life and TV shows. Every time the Royal Rumble comes up or WrestleMania, I'm not watching that online. I'm pirating that whole thing. I'm not paying an extra whatever for pay-per-view. I watch it for free. Because to me, it doesn't require that amount of money to watch something that I feel like should be free to broadcast in the first place. And movies. Clearly, I could just sign up for the streaming service and find wherever this thing is being broadcast and watch it there. But sometimes it's just easier to watch it online. And Game of Thrones, Last of Us. Game of Thrones is a huge example of this. It's probably the most pirated TV show ever, and I was one of them. Watching every new episode as soon as it was available was like the thing to do. Because HBO had it locked behind their service that people didn't want to pay extra money for, so many people pirated that TV show. Was that right? Probably not. But I don't really care. You know, that's the problem. That's the discussion we're having. I would be down to pirate Digimon Data Squad because Disney technically owns the rights. Oh, what a random one. And that's the problem with modern streaming. There are so many streaming services. Yeah, see? If there was one that had all of them, maybe even two, I would accept that. But there's like a dozen of them, and they're all like $15. I don't have that much money. I feel like at some point we have to mention literature in public domain. Cable basically devolved into streaming. Yeah, streaming is the new cable. That's absolutely true. And when there was only Netflix, piracy went down a lot because watching on Netflix was just easier. It'd be 2075 before Pac-Man becomes public domain. Kill me! Right, public domain. This is a really good, another great thing to bring up, right? And we have just enough time to talk about it. When is something acceptable to be used by everyone? Public domain, right? Like old movies, Frankenstein, Dracula, all those old horror movies, all those old classic black and white movies, everyone can use them because they're super old. Everyone has access to them. At some point, video games will enter that public domain. But the problem is, like, the first video games. Well, let's do a quick search. When were the first video games made? What's the years we're talking about? So it is thought that the first video game made was in 1958 by physicist William Higginbotham. It was a very simple tennis game similar to Pong. Okay, so let's say that's the very first game, 1958. Copyright for that type of media is like 95 years at this point. So that will not be available until 2053 as a public domain. That is insanity. The very first video game won't be publicly available. Let's just say it's Pong for sake of argument. The very first one won't be publicly available until 2058. That's... oh my god. 34 years from now. I'll be an old man by the time that is publicly available. And that is when we start finally getting video games into public domain. And then 2075 for Pac-Man. That's so insane, dude. It should not be that long. And you can blame Disney for that, right? Disney was like the one reason that happened. To protect their stupid Mickey Mouse. Steamboat Willie. But there you go. Public domain. Personally, I think it should be a lot shorter. What year? Maybe 50 years? I think like the average lifetime of a person is kind of fair. 80 years would even be fair, in my opinion. But not 95. 80 is still pushing it. Like 75 would probably be more acceptable. Still long, but existence of Walt Disney has extended it from 75 to 95. So it was 75 years originally. See, that's such a reasonable number. It's a long time, but it's enough to cover the lifetime of the original creator. You know? So then it... oh, so here's the argument. Should older video games be publicly available right now? I mean, Atari is not really around anymore. Their games... the people who own them are the people who owns Atari. You know, their old content. They're not selling them anymore. They're not using them anymore. So shouldn't it be publicly available because it's been such a long time? Yeah, I think so. Now, I'm not saying, like, Super Mario Brothers should be public domain. I think we're actually still in a kind of era where that's still definitely Nintendo's product. But at some point, you have to argue the public has a right to this. The public has a right to own stuff that's been out for long enough. Because it's bled into the public culture for such a long time. That's why public domain is a thing. It would be insanity to protect the rights of the person who wrote Frankenstein hundreds of years ago. It would be insanity. And at some point, it just becomes ridiculous to protect those type of rights. When it was originally defined as like 30 years. 30 years. That's a bit short, I think. 50 years would probably be my number, if I had to pick one. I think 50 years is a fair amount of time. Because if you've had a product be successful for 50 years, I think you've had your turn with it, right? 30 years, and it's been nearly doubled. It's been tripled. Oh, by 1928 it was 55, right? God. It's nearly doubled. Yeah, it's almost 100 years. If Disney had kept fighting for it, they probably would have gotten it more. So what does this have to do with game piracy? Well, the idea of older game piracy is that at some point, this doesn't belong to the companies anymore. It belongs to the public. And while technically some of these games being pirated is definitely a bad thing, the majority of them, especially when it comes to older games being preserved, this is the right thing to do. Without this, these games would be gone. They'd be ghost. They would be old relics you'd find, like, oh, you know that classic old game of Galaga that came out, the original Pong. They're gone. The original copies don't exist anymore. You know that classic movie Star Wars? It doesn't exist on film anymore. So you can't have it anymore. No one will ever be able to watch it except for old recordings anymore. That's the type of thing we're talking about. To lose that type of history even if it's the smallest, most irrelevant of video games, it still needs to be preserved. And the idea of public domain and the emulation of games crosses over so well, because the whole point is it needs to be preserved. It needs to be allow for older generations to, or newer generations, I should say, newer generations to experience these old video games, to work with them, to understand everything. The historical aspect alone is important enough, but then there's so much more to it. Like, to be inspired by older games and the older ideas of video gaming, and to create something based off of those older games. If they are lost forever, that will never be possible. Game preservation is huge. Yeah, 50 years is reasonable. 45-ish. Yeah. I think everyone agrees that's a good zone. And that's where it ended up, kind of, right before Disney got involved. A couple years ago, I was looking for Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005, and I could just not find it anywhere because no one bothered to preserve it. Man, and that's such a sad thing. Could you imagine someone living long enough that, say they're 60 years old, and they were one of the first people to play Super Mario Brothers, and then they wanted to play that old video game, like maybe it was their first video game. Could you imagine how stupid it would be if that person would no longer be able to play the original game, even if it was just on their computer? That would be just a tragedy. There is no original Tetris. Yeah, don't you know there are stacking blocks of the same? The code doesn't exist. The original Russian Tetris copies for the Electronica 60 don't exist? Really? Wow. The original Tetris is gone? And that's like the Mount Rushmore of games. If we're talking about like the Mount Rushmore of games, it's Super Mario Brothers, Pong, Tetris, and Fortnite. No, I'm sorry. Sorry. Oh my god. That's such a loss, right? Pokemon, that'd be a good one. That'd be a good pick. Yeah. Or Minecraft. There's a fifth Rushmore. Minecraft's definitely there. But yeah, and that's the sad part. And that's why game piracy is a good thing some of the time. At least when it comes to older games, all of the time. Tetris, you mean the game that someone only just recently beat? Yes, actually, you're paying attention. Why is this in my lo-fi song? I'm gonna skip that. Wow. Yeah, can you imagine that? If Tetris wasn't preserved, we wouldn't have history like finally beating Tetris decades after it was made. You've beaten Pac-Man? Well done. Well done. Alright, I think that's all the time we have. I think we've covered everything we can on this topic. So I will leave you guys to it. I will start getting ready for our stream at 6:30 of Terraria. And we will go from there. Mount Rushmore games is probably Tetris, Minecraft, Mario, Doom. You know what? Yeah, FPS games. Doom is the FPS godfather. Does Minecraft deserve to be up there? Is it too young? I don't know, though. Minecraft's huge, guys. Minecraft is like... It might be the biggest video game of all time. But we can always have that discussion in the Discord, right? Is it too young to be on the Mount Rushmore? What was the Minecraft before Minecraft? You know, that's the real question. What inspired Minecraft? Okay, guys, I will leave you to it. I will see as much of you as possible in about 26 minutes. Yeah, I'll get ready. I'll post it up. I'll make whatever dinner I can between now and then. Terraria, get out of here. The MC before MC is Tetris. There's the solution. Tetris. All right, guys, thank you all so much for the discussion. I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys did as well. I hope it kind of helped expand your perspective on these things. I hope you learned a little something. I know for certain I did. I didn't even think about stuff like that. But it's important to talk about this stuff. And maybe it'd be a nice business venture, might make you millions someday. Make the Netflix of gaming. Steam clearly isn't doing it, so you do it. Just keep that in mind. All right, guys, I'll see you later.